Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking a moment out of your afternoon, or several moments out of your afternoon, to listen to what our experts have to say and to engage with them on a very important topic, the 2020-21 California state budget, and in particular, its impact on the state's K-12 public schools. On the heels of several uneventful years for public education funding, this year has been a whirlwind of developments. It's been like a soap opera, tracking all the changes and twists and turns from week to week. What we're going to try to do over the next 90 minutes is to demystify everything that's happened and to take you through the process that we've gone on from the governor's January budget to the May 15th revision, which seems like years ago now, and then what happened in the debate over the governor's May revision, the legislative counterproposal, and the bill which they just agreed on that will produce the budget you'll be dealing with in this upcoming year. Fortunately, we have a lot of great experts on hand to discuss that with you. But before we get to the heart of the presentation, I would like to go over some housekeeping details. Specifically, we want you to be able to participate and to ask questions of our experts today. To do that, I would refer you to the Q&A panel. That's part of the module which you should see in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Within the panel, there are a number of gray menu bars. If you look down near the bottom, one is labeled questions. It has a triangle which is pointed toward the right. If you click on that so that the triangle is now facing downward, that will open up a box into which you can type your question the same way as you would in email or text, hit send, and staff will get that behind the scene, and we will reserve that question to present to our hosts during the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. There won't be questions as they're giving their slides, but after they have presented all those slides, we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end where we will field questions on a variety of budget-related topics. So with no further ado, I'll introduce today's presenters. First off, we have Dennis Myers, the Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations. Next, we have Cheryl Ide, who is a legislative advocate here and an expert on budget matters for CSBA. Our General Counsel and Chief of Staff, Keith Bray, is in the third spot. And batting cleanup, we have Erica Hoffman, our legislative advocate, who is expert on many matters, but particularly federal budget and legislation. So thank you for that. We are now ready to jump into the heart of the presentation, and I give you Dennis Myers.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We have a lot to talk about today. Just thinking about how this all started in January, we've really been through 4 budgets, and luckily today the Senate is going to be finalizing its vote and getting this to the governor. But here's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to dig deep on all these issues, but just generally, this budget is a flat budget, meaning the amount that the state is your spending levels are held flat. So we're going to get into more detail on that in a minute because there's no cost of living increase in LCFF. If you recall, that wasn't the case in the May revision. But again, no major reductions. That 10% cut is not included in here. But the state is relying on double the amount of deferrals that were proposed in the May revision. Again, these are good things or bad things. The good things are that it allows you to keep spending at these levels. It just means that you're not going to get reimbursed for some of that spending clear into the next fiscal year. Also, heavy reliance on federal funding. This is on the CARES Act funding that's already been provided. While we wait for another round, the state has allocated this to make up for the flat funding. A couple of other provisions in here is you've heard a lot of conversation about hold harmlesses for ADA. Again, there's some good things in that, but then some challenges for districts that are actually growing in their enrollments as well. And then also we'll talk a little bit later about the prohibitions on layoffs, both for certificated and then also for classified employees as well. And then a new learning continuity and attendance plan, which is meant to replace the LCAP that we're familiar with as we go into this next year, where there's be some, a lot of distance learning going on and things. So again, these are kind of the major highlights. Now we're going to start digging deep and explaining a lot of these issues so that you can understand this as you set forth to get into the next fiscal year. So I'm now going to turn it over to Cheryl Ida, who's going to cover the details of the budget. Cheryl.
I'm sorry, I'm just checking, make sure my webcam's on. Hi, Cheryl Ida with CSBA. Just going to go over the differences between what we saw in the legislative budget versus what's actually ending up in the deal. The Senate's about to vote on it right now. I have it right in front of me, so we're watching for the bill. But what you saw in the legislative budget was about $78.5 billion for this budget year. What they settled on was about $70.5 billion, with deferrals starting with the legislative budget in October 1st, but now it's going to get pushed back to February 1st. These are for a lack of federal funds, and to the extent that we receive federal funds, additional federal funds on top of what we've already gotten, we may see reductions or even pushbacks of when those deferrals begin. The deferral amounts are largely the same, but you see a little bit of a spike in the additional federal funds. So when we saw the legislative budget, it was $4.6 billion. In deferrals. Now we're going to see about $5.7 billion without federal funds. But the good thing is that the difference between the proposal from May until the budget deal was that there's up to $300 million in deferral hardship. So to the extent that you don't have the ability to borrow funding or moving cash around to make ends meet, you'll get up to $300 million per month in hardship funding if you apply by the time specified in the trailer bill language. Legislative budget did include a 2.31% COLA, but that was unfortunately rejected. And we saw $2.9 billion in federal funds for LCFF. The budget deal that was struck was $2.9 billion based on supplemental and concentration grants. And if you recall, the May revision had $2.4 billion that only went out just to concentration grants. This is actually a good place that we kind of met in the middle of the compromise between the houses and the administration. The $1.5 billion for special education was adopted, as well as the $1.4 billion in Title I allocation in federal funds was adopted. Next slide, please. And another thing we saw that was new in the legislative budget was $112 million for school meal reimbursements during school closures for COVID. That was also adopted. We saw $100 million in the May revision for community schools that would go out to COEs, but the legislative budget, and then also what was adopted, was $45 billion for existing community schools, just in a recognition that that was something that was a priority of the administration, and then to help out given the pandemic and what the services community schools provide. Also $6 million for professional development was adopted. The other big piece that we see that wasn't previously in there was $980 million based on LCFF. So that's additional funding that's going to go out for LCFF. $540 million of that was Proposition 98, and then $440 million was federal funds. While there was COLA and fully funding CTE and after school and adult ed, as well as other categoricals in legislature budget, they get the full funding for those, but there's unfortunately no COLA, just like there isn't for LCFF. The special education package that the legislature proposed was adopted, which was $545 million for the base rate, and then $100 million for low incidence. There's $23 million, an additional $1 million in federal IDA funding for teacher scholarships and mediation for special education, and then also $4 million for dyslexia research. This is up from $2 million in legislature's budget. The adoption of the 3-year base rates for the new formula for special education was rejected. Next slide, please. And this is a really, really big piece. This is exciting for us because this is going to bring Proposition 98 up to a 40% general fund. This was originally in the May revision as part of the administration's proposal to bring up 1.5% up to general fund to $13 billion total. so that we can get to 40%, because right now we're about 38%. That was adopted in this budget deal. The $2.3 billion that was also part of the May revision and legislature budget to buy down the PERS and STRS rate on behalf of districts, which is about 2% through each pool, was also adopted. A new proposal that we saw from the legislature was $50 million to establish an early literacy support block grant, and $3 million to the Department of Education for literacy expertise, also was adopted in this budget. Next slide, please. So while those were the major funding highlights, there's a lot of technical changes in there that may or may not be of interest to you, but those are the major funding highlights. So the next piece that we're going to move on to is the major policy changes that we saw in this budget that's currently moving forward. So what we're calling the 1920 hold harmless, in which that we use the 1920 ADA as a basis for funding in 2021 school year, it's not necessarily a hold harmless in the way that we would typically think of a hold harmless, where you can't go backwards, but you can go forward as far as growth. This is more of a freeze, where that the 1920 ADA is what you're going to be using for the 2021. So the little problem that Dennis kind of alluded to earlier about how it doesn't necessarily accommodate for any growth in districts. The thought process behind this, and this was talked about in the legislature as well, is that if you had many parents moving their kids to charter schools for distance learning for whatever purposes, then they would be double counted twice. And so while everybody is being held flat, it affects about 10% of districts that may be growing, is what the thought process was behind that. And so we do understand that that is a concern for some districts moving forward. It also maintains the instructional day requirements, but allows for flexibility in the instructional minute requirements for the school years, which is pretty substantial. So it gives you some flexibility in recognizing that, you know, things may be different in a hybrid learning environment, that or especially when you're in a pandemic environment and you maybe need to wash hands, or it takes longer to do temperatures. So having that flexibility as in less requirement of minutes in the total year amount that you have is going to give districts some room to be able to make the adjustments needed in this next upcoming year. Another major policy change that we're still kind of working on, and there's been some movement on as we've been talking with both the legislature and the administration on, is there's a kind of narrow definition of distance learning right now. When schools transitioned over from the March closing pretty much, and then over into distance learning, it was kind of a open-ended conversation on how we figure that out. So this is going to be much more prescriptive. However, we do have some concerns with the way that not only is it kind of narrowly defined, but also there's some pretty heavy audit penalties to the extent that you don't do anything as a very prescriptive way there. So we're working on some cleanup on that. Assembly just submitted a letter to the Journal in order to get some clarification, in order to ensure that we can do hybrid learning, because right now the criteria looks like you can only do distance learning if, one, you are under a statewide or countywide order to close or for guidance, or you have a medically fragile student, or you're being quarantined for COVID. So that seems pretty restrictive. And so we just want to make sure that we have flexibility in providing the kind of models that we need to see at a district level. And so the Assembly just put a note in the Journal. It sounds like the Senate's putting one in the Journal today. And then we're going to look for some cleanup language in order to make sure that we have that ultimate flexibility, given the high audit penalties, if we did not have it very clear in current law. Another major policy changes is it creates a one-year learning continuity and attendance plan. So this is not by coincidence that it also has the same acronym as an LCAP, but it's substantially different because it has a lot of new criteria as it relates to both the in-person and distance learning models, as well as how we take attendance in there, and then how you plan to use as expenditures, including the federal funding. Next slide, please. So the next piece also was a nice little kicker towards the end, and we didn't necessarily see coming, but if you saw your emails, we kind of notified that we'd heard some rumors, and unfortunately they were true. So this kind of removes one of the tools that we have in our toolbox to be able to balance budgets, and it prohibits the summer layoffs of certificated employees except for the administrators and supervisory positions. So that's unfortunate, given the kind of constraints that we're going to have. The other piece is that it also prohibits certain classified employees, and specifically those are custodial, transportation, and nutrition. And it also includes intent language that would include that we would have retaining classified employees in 2021. So while intent language isn't necessarily enforceable, we kind of understand where they're going here. So something to be aware of as we look forward to this next budget and how you do your new COVID LCAP. Next slide, please. So the short-term flexibilities were adopted that were included in the May revision proposal. So I'll go over those really quickly. You are allowed to increase your interfund borrowing between various special funds within your district budget up to 80% for 2 years. So that should help. It's intended to help with the cash flow issues that are coming with deferrals. Another thing that you're allowed to do is allowed to sell surplus property for one-time spending purposes for 4 years. So to the extent that you choose to do that and sell your surplus property, just remember it's only for one-time spending, and probably just don't use it for your special education purposes, because that would affect your MOEs, and we wouldn't want to see that right now given the economy and how things are moving forward in the budget. The other piece was excluding the pension payments made on behalf of the state for districts as part of your routine restricted maintenance account. So the routine restricted maintenance account has that 3% requirement of your total general fund. There was a SACS technical glitch, excuse me, that was counting the total amount the state was providing for districts plus their general fund and counting the 3% of that total, when it really, since you never saw that cash from what the state paid for on behalf of your pension pool, it shouldn't be counted in that 3%. So we got that technical change made, and that was based on an effort of CSBA and a couple other folks that noticed that and brought it to the attention of the legislature and the administration. It also extends the audit timelines given the very condensed periods that we have and planning for reopening. So that's also helpful for us. Next slide, please.
Great, I'll take it from here. Let's look at these deferrals. So you've heard about deferrals. Many of you who have perhaps been on your boards through the Great Recession know what deferrals mean. But essentially, let's walk through these so we can understand them here. In the current year, so this is the year that we just have a couple days left on, the budget trailer bill that passed a few weeks ago included a deferral of the June apportionment. That's the one that you were to have received here in the month of June. That deferral went to July 15th. So meaning you're still spending that money. The state is reimbursing you, but instead of reimbursing you in June, they're reimbursing you in 2 weeks from now into the next fiscal year to pay that off. A lot easier to do a 1 month deferral at the end of the fiscal year, and it's when we look at the rest of these deferrals that it really starts to get interesting and challenging. So included in this budget then are deferrals that is in this next group. Starting in February, deferrals begin. So this February apportionment, so this is money that you're expecting to be reimbursed by the state of California. So if you are a district that has low assessed valuation, low property taxes, you depend a lot more on state apportionments. If you are a higher wealth district, you depend less on state apportionments and obviously more on your property taxes. So here's how this works. So at the state level, the budget is written that there's $1.54 billion from the February apportionment that will be deferred until November. So counting on our fingers here, because that's what I was doing a moment ago, that's a 9-month deferral. So here's how this works is almost half of that payment that you are expecting from the state for February, you would actually get in November then of the next fiscal year. So you can still spend that February apportionment. You're just not going to get reimbursed for that until November of the next fiscal year. Now, moving into March, you see that it's a bigger number, and of course, it's a larger portion of the deferral. So it's almost three-fourths of the March apportionment then gets deferred into the next fiscal year, and then you would get paid for that in October. So that's now a 5-month deferral, a 7-month deferral, sorry. The next one is taking April and pushing that out and getting paid in September. And then you can see there in May, that apportionment pushing out to August. So each of the March, April, May deferrals are about 3/4 of what the state owes you. And then the deferral that happened just now for June gets repeated again in this next fiscal year. So you can see the issue is that this allows the state to do to actually score less money going to schools in the current fiscal year, while allowing LEAs to continue to spend at that level. So the difference is the deferral, meaning you can spend at this level, and you're going to get paid back that difference in 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9 months. We've done this before. It allows the state it allows us to spend at that level, but not actually cut the way the state ledger shows the reduction. On our ledger, it shows money owed to us, not necessarily the reduction. So that's how we get to the point of saying that this is a no cuts budget. It's because you're funded at the 2019-2020 LCFF level, but those repayments are pushed off into the next fiscal year. What this does require then, go ahead to the next slide, is it means that you've just got some cash flow issues that you'll have to manage locally. CSBA does have a school cash reserve program. It's a program that finances cash flow needs through tax revenue anticipation notes, what we call TRANS. CSBA has been doing this for several years. Typically, there are 2 TRANS that are issued throughout the year. The fall one is closed right now, and that is meant to kind of cover cash flow within the fiscal year. But the spring issuance now is the one that we will need to focus on, and what you'll need to focus on, because that would allow financing across fiscal years, because that's what these deferrals do, is you're spending the money in this fiscal year, but you're getting paid in the next fiscal year. So it allows you to finance that dry period. You will be looking obviously at using your own reserves for some of this, but for a lot of you, you're going to need to finance that, and we do have the program in place. The reason why this is a good deal is because it's a pool, so that all the costs are shared amongst all the participants. And as I said, we've been doing this for many, many years. We've completed more than 6,000 TRANS so far. So at the bottom here, and then also at the end, we will refer you to Nicole Delos Reyes on our staff who can help you get started. There's like filling out a mortgage. There's things that you need to do to prove income and audits and things like that. So it's just collecting all that paperwork to make sure that it happens on time. Also, you will see at the end too, we're announcing a handful of other webinars coming up. One that we've just added today is one that will cover cash flow financing and go through the TRANS process. Next slide, please. Now, when we say whether or not this is flat funding, so here's how the legislature is looking at it. Here's how we are calculating this. This is how your labor groups are calculating this. And we also think that as you put your budget together, you're going to see this as well. So whether or not this is a flat funded budget, I think we can assume that it's a no cuts budget, because as you recall, in the May revision, there was this proposal for a 10% reduction. That was not adopted. So here's what the legislature has done. One, starting with a 0 cost of living increase. So that's the flat funding component. No increase in between current year and next year in LCFF funding and most of the other programs. So starting there, everyone is held flat. Now, where is some extra cash in this budget? Because there are provisions that allow you extra cash to spend to get through this next fiscal year. First of all, in state funding, the legislature adopted an increase to special education funding. So this includes $545 million to go into what's known as the base rate. and then another $100 million to go toward low incidence disabilities cost pool. So that's two pieces of this money that's going out to LEAs. And what this does is that the first part increases the base rate to about $625 per ADA. So depending on where you are in that base rate, if your base rate right now is $630, you're not going to see any of this funding. But if you're that district that has a base rate of $630, but you've got some high cost, low incidence students, then obviously you could play into this $100 million. So all districts are going to benefit. Actually, I think 90% of LEAs are going to benefit through this piece of the budget, but the varied amount depending on where you are with your base rate and then the number of low cost or low incidence students that you have. Now, moving on to the next piece, as you've heard throughout since the January budget, the move to buy down the employer contribution rates for CalPERS and CalSTRS. That survived the budget. So that is in place now. And what this does is this takes money from the state general fund that was going to be used in a couple of years to buy down the unfunded liability. The governor said, let's take that money and put it into actually buy down the rate in 2020, 2021, and then in the next fiscal year. And what this does is it buys down the rate by about 2 percentage points. So knowing that most of you are spending between 80 and 90% of your budgets on people, this is real spendable cash because that's a reduction of about 2 percentage points. Through our calculation, it's about the equivalent of a 1.6 or 1.8% increase on your whole budget. So again, that's real spendable money that's been freed up to now cover some of your other costs related to reopening safely and so on and so forth. Now, the next thing that the budget does is it allocates federal CARES Act money, and it does it in a number of ways. First of all, there's the lion's share is $2.9 billion that goes to all LEAs that have unduplicated students. If you remember the May revision, this was part of the budget that was going out to all districts, all LEAs that had concentration grants. This spreads the money out toward more of the LEAs that have any number of unduplicated students. So it's supplemental and concentration grants. What this is worth is about $80 to $150 per pupil. Again, it depends on what your unduplicated count is. If you've got just maybe 5 or 10% of your ADA is unduplicated students, you're going to be on the lower range of this. If you have a high unduplicated count, let's say in the 80s or the 90s, 90%, then you're going to see about $150 per student. So again, almost all districts, all LEAs benefit from this, but again, it's a varied benefit. So the employer contribution rates, everyone benefits about the same amount. This first part of the Federal CARES Act, most benefit, but it's a varied benefit. The next one is $1.5 billion to all LEAs with special education. Again, it's a varied benefit depending on how many special ed students you have, but on average, that's worth about 2.5%. So, starting to accumulate in your head kind of, all right, what does this all add up to? The last piece there, and I have this listed under federal, but it's a combination of federal and state. But this is putting out $980 million just per the LCFF formula. So this is not putting it into LCFF, it's distributing it in a similar fashion so that everybody benefits, like through a base grant plus supplemental concentration grant. It uses that same math, but it's not rolled into LCFF. It's one-time money meant to not increase the state's LCFF obligation, but to provide you with some spendable cash to get you through this next fiscal year. So if you take the increases there and add them up from the PERS and STRS, add to that the $2.9 billion for unduplicated pupils, add to that the Federal CARES Act money going out to special education, add to that then this amount of money going out per LCFF, you can see here that the actual increases in funding in this next fiscal year, again, this is one-time money, but it does get you through this fiscal year. It could be between 3 to 5%. Flat funding in LCFF, add to it these one-time monies through special ed, through Federal CARES Act, and you'll start seeing, as you start working through your budgets, an increase in spendable cash between 3 and 5%. So that's how you work through this and start your budgeting. As you look into, you probably already adopted your budget, so as you look at your budget revisions, you'll see at where you might be able to find some of the extra money that is there to soften the fact that there's deferrals and to soften the fact that funding within the LCFF is being held flat. Next up, we've got Keith Bray coming up to talk through a couple of new issues that are included in this budget. So Keith, come on up on the screen and we can go to the new learning continuity plans.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't see myself yet, but that's probably, there we are. We wanted to spend just a few moments this afternoon talking about the new learning continuity and attendance plan. It is in the budget trailer bill that we anticipate to be passed today and signed by the governor. What it does do is it suspends the LCAP for this given year. Both Cheryl and Dennis have talked about that. But it does really begin to start the process for the development of the plan for the coming year. And that plan is going to be adopted by all boards by September 30th. A template is supposed to be coming out and will come out from CDE by August 1. So you'll have about 61 days to turn this around. Now, the good news is that the procedural aspects of the development of the learning plan are very similar, if not really the same as what you've done with your LCAP, except they'll just be in a much more condensed fashion. So you will have to have stakeholder involvement, which includes bargaining units, includes your staff, parents, and pupils to develop this plan. The plan that, once before it goes to the board, has to go to the parent advisory committees, including the English Parent Advisory Committee for their comments. And you'll have to have the superintendent respond to those comments, just like you would with the LCAP. There'll be 2 meetings that will be required to adopt the learning plan. Obviously, the first one is a first reading, and then you'll have to have a second meeting in which the plan is adopted. So it gives that period of time, just like you do with your LCAPs. I think Cheryl mentioned the budget overview for parents. That is still in play. It's not due, I don't believe, until December 15. But this is different. And so this plan that you'll then adopt goes to, if you're a district, it goes to the county superintendent by September 30. County superintendent will have until October 30 to make any recommendations for your considerations, which you then would take into account and adopt the plan by November 15. That's the target date for this, in the event that the county superintendent gives you recommendations to consider. You're a county board and county office that has you send your plan to the superintendent of public instruction, and he would be under the same, and you would be under the same deadline to get it done by November 15. The notices for these plans have to be done in the most efficient way possible. So when you're going to be working on your plan, it doesn't have to be a written notice. It can be done virtually, but that will be left up for each district to determine its efficiency. So that's the kind of procedural makeup. And one of the reasons why we wanted to include it today is that CSBA is committing to helping boards meet their obligation to adopt a plan by September 30 by helping boards out. We'll be doing some training behind this plan. Won't have a lot of time. The template comes out by August 1, and we'll kick it into gear right after that to make sure that school boards up and down the state are addressing this new requirement. What does the plan include? If we could have the next slide, please. It's different than the LCAP. There's going to be a lot of information that you're going to have in this plan that will help in 2021. We are talking about 2021. If I could have the next slide, that would be great. If not, I'll just, there we go. There's going to be a lot of information that is going to be informative in this plan, all about what's happening in 2021. You're going to have to describe the continuity of learning in your program, and how that full curriculum that you are going to deliver to the students is going to be done, regardless of the means by which it's delivered, whether it's in person, whether it is going to be by distance learning. However that's going to be accomplished will have to be described in this plan. You'll have to have separate components of the plan. Here's going to be our in-learning curriculum. This is how we're going to deliver on learning, in-learning curriculum, and this is how we're going to deliver the curriculum in distance learning. So that will also be a part of the plan, and you'll have to address how there'll be instructional continuity between the two. You've got to address how you are responding to any loss of learning for 1920 and in 2021 that it has occurred or we anticipate to occur. Student learning loss is a big part of the new requirements under distance learning that Cheryl mentioned. And responding to that, the legislature has at least shown their intent that we're going to be doing in-person learning for 2021. Your plans will have to address how any learning loss will be redressed by the district. Specific strategies for English learners, foster youth, homeless students, all of the more vulnerable student populations will be addressed in your plan. What professional development will you have to develop the needs and the tools for the teachers to teach in this environment, whether it's distance learning or an in-learning learning environment that is much different than they've ever had before because of our physical distancing requirements? What resources will be provided to staff and students to address trauma and other issues related to COVID-19? How are you going to outreach to pupils who are not meeting their compulsory attendance requirements? That will be in this plan as well. We're going to have to measure and show how you're going to measure student participation in the instructional program, whatever is the one that you land on. And we're going to have to show in this plan how we're going to assess pupil progress. And that pupil progress is then connected to kind of the time value. How are we going to measure the amount of time that students are getting in the instructional modality that the district has chosen? And again, we'll circle back if you haven't already been providing professional development for the distance learning strategies in your plan. You'll have to address how you're going to do that. And the last bullet there is something that is at the top of our list, which is how the mental, social, and emotional health of students will be supported by the district. All of that goes in the plan. It's the same language that you're used to seeing, specific actions. We have to list out the specific actions and then the expenditures to support those actions. So much of it is what you've done with the development of your LCAPs, but clearly the subject matter is different. It is related to what we went through just the last few months with the closure of our schools, where that happened pretty dang quickly. I think all of us are finding out that reopening of the schools is going to be a little bit more difficult, and this will be the plan. This is going to be the different. This will be your guide to be able to assess and to plan for the delivery of the education in 2021 to the students that you serve. So without that's what we have for learning continuity and attendance plans. Cheryl Ida is going to now pick up the next slide. Cheryl.
Hi, so there are some unresolved issues. I kind of touched on a little bit of them and we've talked about them a little bit, but so the ADA hold harmless that we keep referring to, as we mentioned earlier, it doesn't provide for growing districts in this 2021 budget. And so it is something that I know the administration is looking at. Both houses are aware of it. I think they're trying to figure out how that's going to work, given that we can't double count, because if we double count, then that's less funding for everyone. And we're going to see a fiscal cliff moving forward in the out years if that happens as well. The other piece that we saw and we continue to bring up with the administration is that there's no liability exemption, and this hasn't been addressed. Given that schools are, a requirement, they're compulsory. If we don't have a liability exemption for COVID-19, that brings a lot of concern for many districts, given if there's an outbreak or if somebody contracts it. And so it's our understanding that Assemblymember O'Donnell, along with many other authors in both houses, are going to take a look at this and how to propose some liability relief to the extent that districts are doing everything within to the best possible to mitigate any community spread at their sites. The other piece is that distance learning language, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So the way that the language reads right now is there's the two criteria in which you can provide distance learning. And it's if you have a public health guidance or a state shutdown, or if the student is medically fragile, or if you're under a quarantine for COVID exposure. So those seem like pretty tight guidelines, medically fragile, or if there's a state or countywide order. And so we have been working on this with some of our other partners to be able to make sure that we have the flexibility needed, because we understand that districts are doing the best they can and are going to implement hybrid models to mitigate maybe the physical distancing that they cannot achieve given the existing footprint in classrooms. There was a letter to the Journal submitted to the Assembly for clarifying that language, and then there was just one submitted that we found out to the Senate right now, because they're on the floor and they just voted on it. So the Senate bill just got off the floor, and that's SB 98 if you are curious. So that's great news. We're still going to work on some clarifying language for distance learning, just to make sure that when audit time does come around, that there's nothing that could be interpreted differently, given that the language does appear a bit restrictive. Next slide. So what's next? While the bill just got off of the Senate floor, the governor has until July 1 to sign it. We won't say final budget, or at least I won't say final budget until we see a signature from the governor, because between now until the time that the bill reaches the governor's desk, he has the ability to let in and veto anything that he wants. And so we could see changes. It's not my understanding that that's what's going to happen, but he does have the authority to do so. So we'll see what happens, and hopefully he signs as soon as he gets it today, and then we can look forward and continue to plan. As you know, the April 15th deadline to file for state income taxes was pushed back to July 15th. And so, we're kind of wondering if we see there's any changes in revenues, they come out better than we expected to be, would we see any August budget revisions? It's not clear if that'll happen. We just got off a call with the Department of Finance, and what they told us was that because there were some forecasts that indicated that we had a higher revenue source, there were some changes made in between May and this budget package that we have in front of us right now. And that is incredibly odd. That never, ever happens coming formally from a Department of Finance staffer. Those changes are usually made, only at May and only at governor's budget. So the fact that they were able to tick up that revenue line for schools and for the rest of the state a little bit before, that was super helpful to us and in our favor. So maybe we could see something even better than that once we see revenues come in. So next thing, federal money. Where is that going? And Erica is going to tell us all about it, because she's our federal expert.
If you could go to the next slide, please. Well, welcome. As you know, under the CARES Act, about $13.5 billion was approved for both K-12 and higher education. As you can see by this budget, that has finally been sent down to the governor's desk. A lot of that CARES money has been appropriated. The push is on right now to get, I don't know if I'm calling it a forced stimulus bill. Let's just leave it at that. It makes it simple. So an additional bill, hopefully, to provide some further funding for schools as we go through this process. When you start looking at all the pieces that you need to do, let alone an opening a school site, but it's in the cleaning, it's in temperatures, it's in all of those things. So there is a push to get further funding provided at the federal level. A number of organizations, which includes CSBA, which includes a lot of the national organizations, have been requesting about $175 billion. And that would kind of go for all of education. Not quite sure how far, if that's going to fly or not. One of the best things in the last couple of weeks that we have heard, though, is that Senator Alexander, who is the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, has actually come out and publicly said that, yeah, education needs some money, and he needs additional money in a stimulus. He mentioned 50 to 75. We'd like to maybe see that double, triple even. But the fact that he's even come out and said that, I think bodes well for us hopefully being able to get something. As you know, the House passed the HEROES Act, which provided $100 billion for K-12 and higher education. That is sitting over in the Senate. The Senate is not going to take that measure up. They even said it was DOA, or dead on arrival, when it got over there. Senator McConnell, though, who is the head of the Senate, is being pushed tremendously to start conversations, to bring up the issue, to get something moving on the stimulus. He has said publicly, middle of July is when they'll start this conversation. The problem is, though, is great, that starts in the middle of July. Hopefully we get something by the end of July. This could run into August. So, I mean, that's kind of, there's an urgency here that the Senate quite isn't responding to. And it's an urgency at a national level. So we are still working, though, with all of our partners back in Washington to try to get this issue moving. Did want to let you know, though, that in the meantime, both the House and the Senate are going to be starting their regular appropriations process to start looking at the federal budget. As far as education funding, it's probably going to be relatively flat funded because of budgetary agreements last year. We might see a little bit of an increase in special ed, maybe a tiny increase in Title I. But it would be nice if they could get this done, because as you know, the fiscal year for the federal government starts October 1, which is the month before the election. So we'll see how this process goes. If they can get through approving the 12 appropriations bills, which is what make up the budget at the federal level. You've got 12 in each house, and they would have to go to some sort of conference committee or some sort of negotiation to get that settled, to get it down. So we'll see how long this takes. Don't be overly surprised, though, as we get closer to September, as we get closer to the middle of September, there becomes more talk about a continuing resolution that would get through the election period. Because usually Congress, for the most part, takes off the month of October. They're in the month of August. I mean, they're gone a lot of August. They're back in September for a little bit, and they're gone again in October for the election. So that's the biggest hope we have. But there are a couple of other pieces of news I really wanted to at least walk you through. One is on interim rules that have been released by the Department of Education on equitable services. You probably heard me talk about this before, but these are the rules that affect Title I funding and the need to provide that funding to private schools for students who qualify as low income, that qualify for Title I funding. The Secretary of Education has, about a month ago, they put out guidance with regards to the use of CARES Act funds and that sort of thing within Title I. They have just now, and at some point this week, probably in the next day or two, there will be interim final rules being published in the Federal Register. These rules will take effect immediately, even though there will be a 30-day comment period. These are better rules than the guidance she put out before, which said that, you know, you'd had to provide CARES Act funding for all your kids, and, you know, you had to basically count every kid in a private school, not just kids that would qualify for Title I. So she's kind of moved that a little bit. It still is rather convoluted, though. Now you would have two options. If a district chooses to use their CARE Act emergency funding and they're going to appropriate it for all kids, then you need to count and provide funding for all students in the private school. But if you're only going to use it for Title I eligible students, then you can just use the Title I count. Yeah, it's confusing. We're still going through it all. I will have more information and we'll put something out through communications for you. This is one piece, though, that I'm hoping we can get into whatever a forced stimulus bill is to get this cleaned up, to get this language taken care of. Senator Alexander, this was a month or so ago when the department first came out with their guidance, didn't like that guidance. Basically, he goes, no, we put this money out, it's for Title I, it's Title I money. What is this private school? You're going to count everything. You count, you know, Title I kids in a private school, and that's what you base the funding on. So I don't think he's going to be much happier with this language. So we'll see how that goes, but that's going to be a push that CSBA and our federal partnership with AXA will be pushing to get something included in that bill, so that hopefully we can take care of this problem once and for all. The other piece of good news, just for all of you, in the food service and the meal programs, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has just come out and has extended a number, in fact, almost all of their meal service waivers and relaxations that were to basically go away, originally set to expire in June 30th. They were extended to August 31st. They have now been extended to June 30th, 2021. So these, I mean, this is great for all of us as far as making sure, you know, how you serve meals and things of that nature. So those, all those waivers have been extended. There is also a couple of new waivers that they're looking at. One, that schools can pause the offer versus serve rule. And that's the piece that really affects high school kids, you know, to take or leave some food items, things like that. So these are coming out. We're going to get some more information on these out to you, but this is great news for all of you as you continue to plan for how you're going to be serving meals, both for students that are on your campus, for students that are distance learning. As you know, in some instances, kids are going to be eating lunch in classrooms now. It's not going to be at a cafeteria. So how do we make all those pieces work? But I will hand this back to Troy now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica, and thanks to all our presenters for that comprehensive overview. But despite how thorough the presentations were, there are still a lot of questions from the audience, and we want to get right to those. I'll dispense with the most popular question right away. By far, the largest number of questions pertain not to a financial item specifically, but to part of the language in AB 77, particularly the language around distance learning and how that should be interpreted. A number of viewers are asking whether the restriction is so severe that it means that distance learning is really only an option for people with medical conditions, or if mandated by the local health officer as a strategy to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, or if there's more latitude for districts to implement distance learning and the language in the bill was more of an encouragement to do as much on-site learning as possible. I know that there's a lot of debate in the education community about this, and there's no definitive answer. But Dennis, I'm hoping you can provide some perspective on where we stand with that right now. Or Cheryl.
Yeah, Cheryl, because she's going to have up to the second an answer for on that one. I was reading her emails just a second ago.
So understandably, that if you've seen the language, it looks like it's very, very restrictive. But the letter to the Journal in both the Assembly and the Senate is specifically, the Assembly right now, we haven't seen the letter to the Journal and the Senate. We just know that there has been one submitted. But it's our understanding that it is going to give you flexibility to be able to specifically do hybrid models and do distance learning. So the language isn't really clear right now, which we're working on to get cleaned up, but the letter to the Journal should be able to give you what you need to be able to move forward to continue to plan for your reopenings with a hybrid model. So, and we're working on things at CSBA too to be able to make that clear. So when audit time comes around, we don't have any lack of clarity there.
And that's the biggest issue here, Troy, because if you just look at the bill and it reads pretty tight. There have been folks here in Sacramento who've talked to various staff, and staff has said, oh, hey, well, our intent was this. But if you look at the language, doesn't really get covered exactly in the intent. And our concern is, all right, so when you get audited, where's the auditor going to do? Is the auditor going to go around the Capitol saying, hey, staff person, what did you mean? No, the auditor is going to look at the language and see if you adhered to the language. And that's the scary part. So that's why it helps to get, absent an actual change in the law, which we're going to continue to work on, this journal entry that Cheryl's talking about, then is something we can then make sure that auditors have, that school boards have, that CBOs have, that everyone has to say, okay, it's pretty clear through this what can or can't happen. And so that's what we're trying to do right now, is just to clear up that confusion, because man, just the letter of the law at that point, it's pretty scary. So we want to make sure that the spirit of the law and what was really intended and meant comes through when it comes to auditor time, because auditors not going to have the benefit of this kind of a seminar right now. So that's why we're taking it very seriously.
And then just one point of clarification, because I can see that somebody's asking what a letter to the Journal is. A letter to the Journal is to the Senate and the Assembly, to their clerk, that it specifically clarifies what that piece of law is, and how to interpret it, aside from what it looks like on its face right now. And so because they know that districts are moving forward and you have 6 weeks in some cases to be able to plan reopening, that your plans are in motion already. So to the extent that we don't get trailer bill or we don't get cleanup language before August 15th or whenever folks open across the desk and signed by the governor, this will be something that we can point to and say, the law is interpreted as giving flexibility to do distance learning and a hybrid model in person. I can see also somebody is saying, like, can we do all distance learning? The administration has made it really, really clear, and that they said that they were in lockstep with the legislature, that they prefer in-person training or in-person instruction, given the concerns around learning loss. But that the interpretation still has flexibility. So that's what we were told as of an hour and a half ago.
All right, so to clarify, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a lot of information packed in there, and I just want to tease it out so our listeners are processing everything. We are working to get a more definitive definition, but it's possible that the language will be interpreted in a less restrictive fashion than the text would suggest, and so that hybrid models are still a viable option for our members. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And in contrast to that, though, there will be extreme scrutiny on districts that go to an all distance learning model, and they may want to have a contingency plan. Is that accurate?
I would seek legal counsel on that one, is what we were told.
Okay, so for those of you who are looking at an all distance learning model, please consult with your attorneys. There is some question of whether that will hold up, but those of you who are looking at a hybrid model should be in a good position, and we will provide more information as that becomes available.
I would only add, Troy,
yeah,
that we're going to want to know what our labor partners think of the letter to the Journal and its legal impact. Typically, letters like that will help with vague and ambiguous language. This is more of a language that's pretty doggone direct, as Dennis was saying. It's just the way in which maybe the language was structured that seemed to limit the ability to use a hybrid program or really any distance learning except in certain instances. So I think the letter, I read the letter. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing it. It does provide the intent of the author to have a hybrid, that it did not mean to exclude a hybrid model. However, I think it's going to be important to work out this interpretation and actions that then would be consistent with the language and this interpretation with our labor partners.
They are one of our partners, by the way. CTA and CFT have been one of our partners in these meetings in order to get this clarification moving forward. But what you do at your individual district level, again, I defer to Keith.
Right, and it all has to, I mean, I guess the point of it, Cheryl, was kind of a big picture going down to the small picture that, this has to be dealt with by the bargaining teams at each district and county office. And so that was really the point of the comment.
Great, and I'm going to go back to Cheryl with the next question, which relates to the hold harmless around funding and around enrollment and attendance. A lot of people are asking whether hold harmless will extend beyond the 2021 school year, and if we can provide any visibility into that.
Not right now, no. To be clear on the hold harmless was something that came about through a lot of negotiations, but the administration did not want to commit to that. And so I think that would be a tough battle again moving forward, but that's not something that we have right now. The administration has explicitly mentioned that by doing a hold harmless for this year, which we thought was vital and very much supportive, is going to create a fiscal cliff in budget year +1. So I don't disagree. I think that there's a lot of movement going on right now, and so how we proceed forward is going to be really, really important. But to answer your question, no, there's not one moving forward. Not right now.
Okay. Thank you for that. We had several questions related to workforce management, particularly layoffs. And one viewer asked if layoffs for custodians, for example, which is one of the protected classes in the legislation, were planned prior to the COVID pandemic for the 2021 budget. Can this district still proceed with those layoffs, or would they need to restore those positions in light of AB 777 and the ban essentially on layoffs of certain classified employees at this time?
Well, I don't know what, Cheryl, you can jump in as well. I'm not sure what is meant by planned. If they've already taken board action and have notified employees, given them their 60-day notice, I think most attorneys are saying that those layoffs are still good to go. This goes into effect July 1. So anything that, although the language, here's the ambiguity, and this is maybe one we'd get a letter to the journal on, but it talks about implement. So no action can be taken by the board as of July 1 to lay off these protected classes. If there has been action taken prior to that, I think that that action, and as long as the notice has been given, that's all that is done with classified employees. You don't circle back around and give a second notice as you do with certificated employees. So that's my sense of it. Now, maybe there's a little intent there that I'm not familiar with. If anybody wants to jump in on that, they can.
I think part of it is just the political interpretation as well. The second case that Keith pointed to is if you started but didn't complete by July 1st, the classified layoff, or if you're looking at your watch right now going, wow, it's June 29th, let's have a meeting tomorrow to give notice, you're going to get challenged. So just know that. And so that's why, we're saying, hey, here's the way the law reads, here's our interpretation, but just know if you do interpret that loosely, you're going to get challenged by labor. And just to be clear right now. So.
Yeah, and there was a request by some folks about potentially putting some sort of letter into the journal, and that was mixed on that piece of it.
Okay. The next question pertains to deferrals. Specifically, is the money available for hardship exemptions for deferrals limited to $300 million, or will any district in need be able to receive a hardship exemption? Cheryl?
So the language specifically says that to the extent that the need exceeds the amount, the anticipated, the $300 million, that finance is going to have to report to the JLBC, Joint Legislative Budget Committee, or Legislative Committee, and reassess on state funds and what to do. So it's kind of unclear how that would be cleared up, but if it would be a proration or an assessment of, I'm not sure, but that's what it specifically says, is that it's going to be an assessment of existing state costs and then a report to the JLBC.
Got it. And so we have a couple questions related to the CARES Act. The first is there an apportionment schedule for the CARES Act that's available and people can reference?
As far as, you mean how much each district is getting? Is that,
I think, and also the timeline involved.
don't have that yet. We don't have that yet. As soon as, I've seen a couple of charts that give an idea of how much each district may get. Those need to be updated. I would presume the funding would be available as soon as possible, but I can double check and find it when that is.
Yeah, it's not going to come out. It's not going to come out like the state apportionment does, which is over a 12-month period. It will be coming out as soon as they can chunk out the numbers. The state has the money. The Department of Ed has to calculate all the entitlements. But there's a requirement that you spend the money before the end of the year. So you can't put that money out on December. So it's going to be coming out sooner rather than later. And as we learn more, we can publish that as well.
Right, and that leads into the second question on CARES. What are the timing and programmatic restrictions on CARES Act funds? And do they have to be spent by December 31st, or can they be used to hire and pay staff?
They can be used for staff. They can be used for a variety of things, as long as what you're looking at are those students predominantly that would be affected, by it. As far as time frame, though, most of it does have to be used by December 30th. There is one chunk of it that is later in the year, and I just can't remember off the top of my head which chunk that is. But keep in mind how you as the district also decide to spend your CARES Act money will influence how you need to account for your equitable services money that is going to private schools. So that's a little piece that just got thrown in. As I said, that language hopefully will be available, that final rule available in the next day or so.
Got it. And so we had a question about that, and I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. The question concerned the Department of Education language that was advocating for funding to go to private schools based on enrollment, as opposed to just those percentage of students who qualify for Title I. So your assessment is that language will prevail, or it's unclear at this time?
Well, it's going to go into effect. The question becomes, how soon can the Senate either put something in that overturns that? I wouldn't urge you to ignore it. Let's just put it that way. What you might end up having to do is going back to the private school and saying, give me some of that back. Because the way the language reads, and this will be the decision of the district, the CARES Act money you get, if you're going to spend it on all of your kids, whether they're Title I or not, you then also need to provide equitable services money, which is a percentage base, to the private school for all of their kids. If you're going to spend it only on Title I students, which is how this funding is coming to the district, or was set aside to come anyhow. It's based upon your Title I counts. You're only going to spend it on Title I kids. Then you only have to provide that percentage based upon Title I numbers for the private school for the equitable services. So she's trying to split the issue here, and yeah, there's going to be issues and problems with this language. But yeah, I mean, that's about as clear as I can get, unfortunately. But the language, as soon as it comes out publicly, which will be this week, so I'm thinking potentially tomorrow or Wednesday, we will get that out to you as soon as possible.
So we'll look forward to future updates on that. A question I see.
Updates on that.
Wonderful. So a question I see here in the queue, and that also I've been hearing from members in various meetings and conversations, relates to physical education, how that can take place in this environment of social distancing, and whether there'll be changes to the rules regarding PE minutes that reflect this new environment. Cheryl?
So the PE minutes have been suspended for this year, for budget year.
Okay, that's actually a simple, clean answer. We love it. Right. Great. One question relates to charter schools, and I think this might be for you, Keith. How much responsibility or what is expected of governing boards and administrative teams in terms of oversight for charter schools and making sure any of these regulations are being observed in the dependent charters?
Oh, in the dependent charters?
Or we'll ask it broadly in any of the charters.
Yeah, the authorizer status has not been suspended. For example, we talked earlier about the learning plan. Charter schools are putting together the same learning plan. They share it with their authorizer. So I think that depending upon the relationship that the charter and the authorizer has, this is obviously the shutdown, and now the reopening is going to accentuate whatever that was, and if it was good, if it wasn't so good. But as an authorizer, you'll continue to have the responsibility to oversee and to make sure that the reports that you are supposed to get, you get, and that the reports that you do get and the information that you do receive shows that the charter school is responding to the requirements, just like either the county office or the districts have to respond to. You'll see in a number of the requirements that are coming out in this budget trailer bill apply to all three entities of districts, county offices, and charters. So as an authorizer, you're still in the authorizing seat.
Thank you, Keith. I'll come back to you with the next question. One of our viewers wants to know, are we facing FAPE lawsuits in the face of parents and students needing to pay for internet to access distance-based learning? As you know, this is a big concern of CSBA as district learning becomes a bigger part of instruction. And we know that a large segment of the student population does not have access to broadband or devices. So a question about liability related to that.
Well, we're going to have a specific legal webinar on that on July 15th and the 29th, where we go into liability, and on the 29th specifically for special ed. You know, certainly as we move past what was really, you know, the preseason, which was last year, as we completed the year into a full year of delivering services in a most difficult way to our vulnerable populations, that yes, there's going to be situations probably increased where there'll be parents challenging the services that are being provided by the districts or by the county offices to the students with special needs. And so the liability will have to go through, you know, the rule of reason, right? As to whether or not the districts are doing what they can in this environment to address those needs. I think the early advisement for last year was not to go in and actually amend IEPs. I think now, as we're looking at a completely new school year, that the districts will have that as more of their response to how services will be provided to special education students would be go in and amend IEPs. Now, if you don't get access with distance learning, that's just not going to be on the special ed students' plate in terms of parents that might be challenging what their child is getting, but also on those that just simply don't have the internet access, whether they're students with special needs or not. But obviously, because of the way the legal framework is established and the whole due process procedures that we have established for special education students, we do anticipate that there will be challenges.
Thank you. One of the viewers wants to know if there's any talk of an adjustment to the 6-foot social distancing requirement, or is that pretty much set in stone?
Well, we saw what happened with the adjustment to the face coverings with the mandate that came out 2 weeks ago that was then changed the next day as to whether or not it applied to schools. And that is still being, as of last week, was still being discussed. The governor brought it up in his press conference that they were still working on the applicability of indoor spaces and the wearing of face coverings. I'm not aware of, and maybe this group of governance experts might be more aware than I of what's going on with the 6-foot recommendation. It comes from the CDC, and then so there's your lineage. It starts at the CDC and it works its way through our public mental health professionals. It's been endorsed by the governor, and it's certainly endorsed by the superintendent of public instruction in his guidance as well. So the critical part of 6 feet is that we have face coverings if that's not possible. But right now, the guidances, and these are recommendations, they're considerations, this is what we should be doing, is in our classrooms, we have 6 feet of space between our desk and 6 feet of space between the desk and the teacher. There will be some practical issues with that, which is why we call it social distancing and just not physical distancing, because that's why we have the staggered schedule. The anticipation is that there'll be less students in the classroom at any given time in order to attempt to meet these physical distancing requirements. My guess would be if there has been such interest in how face coverings and the mandate about face coverings in public places apply to our classrooms, that the same discussions may be taking place with respect to the 6 feet requirement. Either Cheryl or Erica or Dennis, have you heard anything?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard any of those. The 6 feet seems to be, yeah, everybody kind of looks at that, and that is why a lot of the districts are going or are looking at a hybrid model of Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, half days. Right. Spreading kids out because you can't get that many in there. The fact that that is embedded so far into all the guidance that's come out, both the federal guidance that's come out from the state, it's come out from locals. I don't see that piece changing, because the one thing that they couch the masks on, can't do the distance learning, or if you can't do the social distancing, you need to wear a mask, because it's that 6 feet of how far droplets can travel is what they talk about. But I haven't heard of any of that as far as changing what that spacing is.
I've seen some writing challenging the 6 feet that it's not data based, but as Erica pointed out, it's in all the guidances. It's what we have to work with. The county public health, state public health are all standing by it, just not for schools, but for every public place. And outside those public places, I mean, it applies to when you're standing in line to get on a bus. It applies when you're standing in line to get into the school. It applies in our corridors. So it's going to be something that we're going to have to work through until or unless there's more guidance given to us by either the governor or the public health officers. But I guess because it's pretty consistent that it's a should, even though it is a should, it's consistent through all the guidances, and that's something that districts are looking to follow.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. I hope the audience does as well. I just want to bring back another issue we touched on briefly, because I'm seeing multiple questions about it. So the hold harmless does not include any allowances for districts that are growing in enrollment. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So a couple people asked about that and just wanted to make sure that we had that confirmed. And then also there are questions regarding budgeting related to projecting LCFF in the out years. Should districts be planning for a zero COLA for 21, 22, 22, 23?
I mean, the COLA is established by the feds, so I mean, whether or
Sky's
not
the
they
limit.
decide, whether or not they decide to fund it is something different. So this year they suspended the COLA, so which they have the discretion to do.
Yeah,
But-
when it comes out to multi-year projections, things like that, you've got to listen to your county office of education, to Department of Finance. So we know that you're looking at that right now, but yeah, I mean, that's where you're going to get the information. That's going to be acceptable kind of in the industry, is looking at, what are the county offices saying, because they talk statewide and kind of come up with kind of the same wording and the same understanding. But anything more than flat, anything more than zero, I think is wishful at this point, and might be challenged. But I mean, we're not the experts on that. You got to really figure that out kind of through talking to your county offices.
Well, and also I think you talk to your CBO, they may have an opinion as well.
No, I know that's what, because I obviously
Yeah.
the CBO, but I'm also thinking they're also kind of tuned into what kind of the CBO industry is talking about as well.
A couple questions regarding attendance and with the new attendance reporting plan and some of the challenges regarding distance learning and some of the other hurdles to clear with, just in terms of keeping up with attendance in this current environment. A lot of districts may have laid off attendance specialists, or some may have laid off attendance specialists, and a couple people asked, who is going to be available to do this work? Should they consider calling those employees back? And just how can they manage this process with their current staff?
It's a really tough question, but I'll try to take a stab at it. The way that the new COVID LCAP states, a lot of it looks like the attendance gathering is going to be by the teachers, because they're the ones that are going to have the live interactions on the daily. So even when you have the hybrid model, how you submit, I don't know. I think that it's probably going to be on an individual level, but there's a heavy lift for teachers in the new COVID LCAP. That's what I'm calling it, just because for ease of the differentiation between our traditional LCAP and this 1 year LCAP.
And that's going to require bargaining. So because it's not typically part of, I guess it is. I mean, teachers do take attendance. I'm thinking more along the lines of just when you're looking at having somebody else do a duty. For example, just when we're back in school and we want to make sure that we're maintaining the 6 feet distance between students in the corridors as they go to and fro. It may be that you're going to have to do that at times where somebody else, like an instructional aide, may be coming on board to help with that type of duty, and that's just something that you're going to have to bargain. I mean, we only have so many noon duty aides, right? But this is going to take, returning to school is going to take a lot more from our classified and our certificated staff, perhaps in doing duties that they haven't done before, and that's going to be subject to your discussions with your labor partners.
We have another forward-looking question regarding late start time and whether districts need to proceed with the transition preparing for the move to a late start time.
I think that goes by default to Dennis.
No, I'm just kind of chuckling because nothing has happened to relieve LEAs of that requirement. So yeah, you're going to have to project out, build into your budget this year and next what you would have had to what you have to do to kind of ramp up to be able to change your start time if you're a unified district or a high school district, or even a feeder district, I guess. So yeah, none of that's been changed yet. It was things that were on the list of potential relaxing of standards, not adopted. So as of right now, the assumption is that we will have the late starts what is it, the 22-23 fiscal year? I mean, it's been like light years since that thing passed. So it's what, a year or two away, and as of right now, you got to work toward implementing that.
Another question concerning deferrals. Do we think they will be paid back on schedule? Are there any concerns about that?
Wow. Well, you know what? It's in the code, so, I'm going to say it's in the statutes. So that gives you some security. The state has a history of paying those back. The deferrals shrink if there's another round of federal stimulus, so be watching that very carefully. That's why, what Erica was saying about, it looks like the Senate is thinking about starting the process, in July. So if that gets taken care of and there's another X billions of dollars coming in to the state in another round, then that obviously reduces the deferrals. But right now, how you finance you have to be thinking about, here's what statute says, and so we're going to finance around what statute says.
Great. Well, thank you for that. We will definitely keep an eye on that as well. It's now 4 o'clock, so we are going to begin the process of wrapping this up. But before we go, we just wanted to let you know about some upcoming webinars we have where we'll be able to dive a little more deeply into some of the questions that you asked today and some of these areas that we've been exploring. Next slide, please. So those webinars begin tomorrow. We have one on science education during COVID-19. I know that everyone is anxious and a little bit stressed about the financial and logistical implications, but we also need to keep an eye on the academic and instructional components. And this webinar does that by exploring how you can implement the next generation science standards in an era of distance and blended learning. And that's tomorrow at noon. And Keith Bray, who is with us, will be leading a couple webinars over the next few weeks. The first is on Wednesday, July 15th at 11 a.m. And he will be with some esteemed guests from our legal partners, examining issues related to reopening and potentially closing schools again during our current COVID-19 pandemic. And then also at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, July 29th, there will be the second installment of that webinar. Is there anything you wanted to say to expand on that, Keith?
Oh, no, thank you, Troy. We're going to focus in the first webinar on legal issues, guidances, which one do we follow, and we'll have some attorneys that have been doing a really good job at that, and also collective bargaining. The second one will focus, which you're going to actually you're going to facilitate. The second one will be on special education and on reopening issues, because we'll be on July 29. We'll be, if haven't already reopened in some instances, we'll be days away from others. Thank you, Troy.
Sure. And then last but not least, on Friday, July 17th, we have the Making Sense of the Budget webinar focused on deferrals and examining what deferrals mean for school finance, what can school districts and COEs expect, and how can they manage the deferral process as well as possible. So again, that's Friday, July 17th at 2 p.m. We will be sending out more information and registration links to our members, so you'll have plenty of time to sign up for these webinars and present your questions ahead of time if you'd like. Also, we will be providing the information from today's webinar. The webinar video will be posted on the CSBA coronavirus website by July 1st, if not earlier. And also the PowerPoint will be available as well and will be emailed out to registrants. So we thank you all for joining us today. We know there's so many demands on your time. We appreciate all the thoughtful and challenging questions, and we hope you join us for our upcoming webinars. Thank you and good day.